Okay, now we can switch to the second topic that I would like to address, which is about reductionism, but more specifically, what reductionism leads to, which is basically the appearance of what is usually called unexpected consequences. Now, I have here again a number of examples to clarify this. The first example comes from what I would call the history of educational technology. And once again, here I'm challenging a little bit the very meaning of, or I'm sort of challenging what we mean by educational technology, because in this case, as educational technology, I'm introducing what is usually called a chemistry set. In this case, the one that you see on this, the one that you see here on the picture is called atomic, which is chemistry sets that dated back to early 60s, and that was actually introduced in England. I don't know other places, but essentially, to cut the story short, this was one of the first examples of educational games. And it was, as you can imagine, a set of things that would allow children to make all sorts of experiments with different substances, with different chemicals. And what was interesting is that in the 50s, there was one particular type of chemistry sets that was introduced, which contained radioactive uranium. Now, this is a substance that has been, of course, banned, but back then, people thought that it was something that we should have not cared of, something that wasn't dangerous for us. Around that time, they actually realized that this was really awful. The problem is that there were some people paying the price for this attitude. There is actually an interesting, if you're interested to know more about the actual history, I have another video which comes from a very interesting BBC documentary, which was a series of documentaries actually dedicated to home killers. And this is a fragment from one of the episodes, which was specifically about dangerous games. And you're going to see some interesting things. Here again, the video is very long. It lasts for about 7 minutes. So you can actually see here is the host of the show that is going to introduce this or talk about this problem of all these chemistry sets that were introduced from the 50s onwards. In the atomic, in the one that I showed you before, the problem was uranium, this radioactive substance. But there were other problems which mostly concerned explosions. So that basically people had, and there is actually an interesting live demonstration here, that they take one of these sets and then they start playing, and they actually discover that, yes, they were very helpful for understanding certain chemical reaction. But the consequences were lethal. There were explosions, and of course, people were also killed. Let's see if I can show you one of these explosions. So you see that there are all these different substances that can be used, and there were lethal consequences. So there were children that actually died, or they were mutilated. And sometimes, actually, they were not. These sets were not misused, or the damage that was produced wasn't intended. Of course, it was just that the game was incredibly dangerous. So, in this case, as you can see, they are wearing some protections, which most likely the children of that time didn't think of, nor their parents. So here you can see an explosion, I think. Yeah, there you go.
Oh, wow.
So you can actually see the smoke, which, of course, I imagine that could excite children, but indeed this is not something recommendable. This was, I showed you this example because very often, when we introduce something, for example, in education, which is our domain of interest, there is something that goes wrong. And something, as I said before, that wasn't intended. And here I have a few conceptual labels that we can use in order to describe this particular situation, the situation in which we want to achieve a certain result, but what happens is that something else happens instead. So these are all, to some extent, they are all synonyms. So we can use unintended consequences or unforeseen consequences. Then there is another, a little bit fancier term, which is second order effects. Second order means that is an order of, that there is an order emerging, an order of things that we're not aware of before this order appears. Then side effects, unexpected outcomes, and ramifications of our actions. But essentially, the main point here is that we do something in order to achieve a certain result, but then what happens instead is not what we thought could happen. So, when we talk about second order effects or unintended consequences, and I would like now to stick to these two terms, what we mean is that every time that we start doing something, we are immediately engaging the future, which means that it's inevitable that when we experiment or we try to use something for doing something else, that something unexpected can happen. And the reason is that the future is fundamentally uncertain. So you see that here I'm slowly shifting the topic, but I will still like to remain on this. What happens with unintended consequences or second order effects is that we can have two types, mainly two types. The first type of unintended consequences is, in the first type, the unintended consequences are immediately visible, and to some extent can actually be foreseen. Okay, but what is interesting in this first type is that the moment in which we start using something, right after we start using it, we see that there are bad outcomes, that there are negative consequences emerging. Of course, consequences that are negative, therefore, they are not intended. There is a second category of unintended consequences, which is way more interesting, which is when the negative effects or the unintended consequences or the side effects remain hidden for a while. This is the case in which we either don't have the knowledge in order to foresee certain effects, negative effects, or we lack the proper frames in order to see, in order to detect the problems. This second type of unintended consequences is particularly interesting, especially in the context of educational technology. And it's also something, sadly to say, that can make us a little bit paranoid when it comes to the use of technology in education. Now, I have a series of examples, some of which are representing or examples of the first type, some others that are examples of the second type of unintended consequences. I'm not going to say anything about this, so you can actually make up your mind yourself. So let's start from the first one. These are all examples concerning technology use in education. This is actually a study, and I'm going to refer here to actual research, to studies that were conducted in this particular field, technology use in education. The first example is something that I briefly touched upon during the first video presentation, which was about note-taking. We have now, I wouldn't say overwhelming evidence, but significant evidence that it's actually better for the learning process if students take notes if they use longhand note taking. In other words, if they use pen and paper. It seems that we have evidence that this type of note taking is more effective for a number of reasons. One of which is that in longhand note taking, when we use handwriting, basically, we are using our muscles to store the information. Another reason is that when we take notes using our laptop, we tend to write word by word what the lecturer is saying. So we're not actually listening to understand, but we're listening to write word by word. The technical term here is verbatim, so we are taking notes verbatim, which another way to say that we write everything that the lecturer is saying. This is claimed to be this is claimed to have detrimental effects on students' understanding, precisely because we're not listening, but we're trying to reproduce the kind of text that is emerging out of the lecture. And in this way, we lose the chance to understand. Of course, this is what is claimed in those articles, what we know from the scientific literature. But of course, one thing that can actually be said is that usually in all these experiments, what we have is the following design. The researchers test the two groups. One group in which the students are using the laptop, and one group in which the students are using handwriting or longhand note-taking. What they usually don't do in these studies is to see how students use their notes once they are at home, for example. So they are focusing exclusively on the lecture. So what the students are doing, how they take notes during the lectures. This is actually important because it shows that it might be that the students use the laptop to take notes, and then they actually produce additional notes with pen and paper once they work on the notes that they have taken during the classroom or during the lecture. Now, but anyway, after this disclaimer, we can actually see here that in the past, let's say roughly 10 years ago, there was a strong push, as I said during the previous video presentation, to tell the students, to encourage students to use their laptop or the mobile device to take notes. And that was supposed to bring about other benefits. For example, they could share their notes, everything was in order, and so on and so forth. Now we can actually see, and this type of study has been done already since 2013, 2014, now we see that this assumption is not holding water. In other words, it seems that there are actually big issues related to the medium, the instruments that we use to take notes. Now, probably in this case will be an example of hidden unintended consequences, because the unintended consequences are not so clear as long as we don't analyze the way in which the meaning that note-taking can have. So let's keep to the second example. The there have been complaints that especially young people, children, could not sleep properly because they were engaged with their tablets for a long time before they actually got to bed. And now we actually have studies here again that are pointing to the fact that even the so-called night shift mode, when in other words the screen of the tablet is not so shiny, even when this mode is on, this may actually prevent people from falling asleep rather quickly. And this is actually related to a chemical process happening in the brain that is based on this substance that is called melatonin. And what they actually say, I can read from the abstract, melatonin's suppression did not significantly differ between the two night shift interventions, which indicates what they did in the experiment, which indicates that changing the spectrum of composition of self-luminous displays without changing their brightness settings may be insufficient for preventing impacts on melatonin suppression. So you actually see here that we're really digging deeper into certain effects that are not yet entirely clear. In this case, there are evidence pointing to the fact that, to cut the story short, it's not good to use to read from the iPad or any kind of tablets, or probably also smartphones, because the technology is the same. It's not always good to do this before we get to bed. Now, this is interesting because some 6-7 years ago there was a rather big hype specifically around the use of tablets, and there was a strong push coming from different perspectives for students, teachers and schools to use tablets instead of books. But then what happens if students are doing some homeworks or they are engaged in some learning activities late at night and they're using their iPads or tablets, where what happens is that they might have problems with sleeping. Now, here again, we see that the connection between iPads, reading from tablets, and failing to fall asleep is not so direct. And yet there is a connection. There is a connection that we have to take into consideration. Now, the third example is about reading. This is actually very close. This is an issue very close to the one that I've just treated. Here again, some 6-7 years ago, there was this strong push, as I said before, to replace the traditional handbook with the equivalent of electronic books. Or in some other cases, there was a strong incentive to switch from traditional forms, like books, printed books, to blog posts and other materials that were available online, so web materials, generally speaking. But then what we saw happening, once again, after this was introduced, and you can actually experience it yourself, is what some authors call the cognitive impatience. So that basically, and this is actually a quote, what happens is that we no longer have the patience to read longer, denser, more difficult texts, because we get used to reading short and short text, perhaps full of images. And this is actually a problem because some people, some researchers have claimed that reading has become more and more like skimming. Now, it's obvious that skimming is superficial, whereas reading goes deeper. And and so there are growing concerns specifically about this issue. Can it be that what happens is that we started considering less and less printed materials when actually those printed materials are more effective for making us engaged in a deeper way with the texts that we are reading? And this is another example, another study. The title is "Reading Across Mediums: Effects of Reading Digital and Print Texts on Comprehension and Calibration." In this case, they had the usual design, research design. One group reading from print text and the other from digital text. And they investigated the level of comprehension that was brought about in these two conditions. And here there are interesting examples, interesting results, and I can read it from the articles. I will actually share all these articles with you, so you will have a chance to read them firsthand. I'm reading from here now. Results demonstrated a clear preference from digital text, and students typically predicted better comprehension when reading digitally. However, performance was not consistent with students' performances and outcome predictions. While there were no differences across mediums when students identified the main idea of the text, so when it's about skimming, students recalled key points linked to the main idea and other relevant information better when engaged with printed materials. Now, this is very interesting because, incidentally, this also shows the idea that students may not actually fully know what kind of media is the best for them. So even when, for example, they can be highly proficient in reading from the smartphone, well, that doesn't mean that they are better than us in digesting all the information that comes from that media. But besides this point, we see here again that there are a number of assumptions that don't hold water as well. So we expect that engaging students with digital materials would improve their engagement, would improve their performance, would improve the comprehension of the text, whereas in fact this is not the case. And once again, I want to stress that in this case too, the results are not so, the situation is not so black and white. Because indeed, as I've just read, they can actually get the idea of the text, but when it comes to deeper comprehension, things start getting a little bit more blurred. And now there is another example. In this case, is effective use of PowerPoint in lectures. Well, here again, we used to think that PowerPoint was a must for any lecture, but after more than a decade of use of this tool, well, we saw a lot of, let's say, perhaps scrap is the right word. I think that you might be familiar with this, so I'll skip it. Then, of course, another very interesting topic to discuss: the meaning of doing a Google search. What is interesting is that we are more and more engaged with Google to do something that is called fact-checking. We want to check if something is the case. But then we forget one thing, that, well, it all depends on Google algorithms. So Google doesn't provide us with the answer to our question, because the answer that Google provides, well, is just one of the possibilities. As we know, Google ranks results according to certain variables, and those variables are prone to be biased. Then, of course, we can continue, and there are many other examples, like, for example, this is brain drain. The mere presence of one's own smartphone reduce availability cognitive capacity. In this case, what the researchers are claiming is that even when you have your smartphone on your desk, this is something disturbing your attention. Even when you are not, you don't want to use it, even when you want to pay attention to what your partner in conversation is saying, yet your attention is randomly attracted by the fact that the phone is there. So the smartphone can be something very useful, but also something that can have detrimental effects on your attention, on our attention, and also the possibility to recruit all our cognitive capacity to deal with the present moment. Then there is also a case with mind wandering. This is another example. In the past, when students were bored, they would usually start mind wandering, which is now we know it's a very important thing because it connects us with our long-term goals, or just our dreams, the thing that we would like to do in the future. But now, as soon as the students get bored, they turn to their smartphone. So mind wandering is somehow impaired by this. And if we think that mind wandering is a sign of a healthy mind, then we may actually start thinking whether it's good to always have the smartphone next to us. Then, of course, there are also other issues that concerns teachers as well. This is more about the importance of being absent. So, for example, already with the cell phone, people could actually contact us at every moment, which is something, of course, very good in case we are in a situation of danger. But it can also be very bad when, for example, we want to stay on our own and we don't want to bother. Or when, for instance, we want to draw a certain boundary between private and public life, or private life and work life. And what has happened with the smartphone, and especially with the use of, in this case, social media for, let's say, teaching or learning purposes, it's increasingly harder to, as I said, to be isolated from the rest of the world. To shut down everything else and just to connect with ourselves, or just to rest. And then, of course, there are also growing concerns about screens. Screens are not always good, but maybe I can skip this. So, in the end, before I come to the third point, what is interesting, and I would like to go back to the previous slides where I we can actually see, I can start from here. Yes, good. So what we can actually see is that indeed the problem of what we can expect from our tools is quite important to face, because as soon as we use any piece of technology, we might have what I called unintended, unforeseen or consequences of second order effects, side effects. In addition to that, we also have to face the problem when such unintended consequences or second-order effects are something that are not immediately visible. I would say that especially because certain unintended consequences are not immediately visible, research should play an important role. But the problem is that research takes a lot of time. It takes time before studies are coming out. Besides, research very often doesn't give, luckily I would say, a clear answer. But what we can do in the meantime is to develop a critical attitude. And the critical attitude is precisely about considering what we can reasonably expect from our tools. A critical attitude, I want to stress, doesn't mean that we're not using anything new because we can have unexpected consequences. No, absolutely. We have to take such risk, but we also have to be very much aware that tools can do things outside of our intentions. And this is actually the third point that I would like to address,